So welcome, good afternoon or morning from where I'm at. This is part of the Early Researchers Seminar Series that's hosted by Cambridge Reproduction, SRI. We're very grateful to the volunteer coordinators for organizing this series and to all the speakers who have agreed to take part. And today we'll have two PhD students, including a visiting researcher, tell us about their work. The seminars will be held online on the third Thursday of each month at 1 p.m. Details of forthcoming seminars for next semester, as well as prior ones, can be found on the SRI website. Cambridge Reproduction is an interdisciplinary initiative that brings together researchers from across the university who have an interest in any aspect of reproduction, from science, technology, and medicine to arts and humanities. Membership is open to all staff and postgrad students, and gets you access to our events, funding schemes, and newsletters, which have highlights, events, and opportunities in reproduction research. You can download the membership form from our website and send it along to Christina Rosnek, who's been hosting us all term and is the Cambridge Reproduction Coordinator. So we're interested in receiving abstracts from students and postdocs for next term. Please let us know if you would be interested in participating. Okay. So now I'll just introduce Irene Domenici, who's a PhD student at the Max Planck Institute for Social Law and Social Policy in Munich, Germany, and is currently visiting the Faculty of Law at Cambridge.
Well, the title of my presentation is also the question I will try to answer for all of you today, and it is, can ethical and religious considerations legitimately influence a publicly funded healthcare system? So I will answer this by first explaining my theoretical foundation, and then I will illustrate this framework using a case study, which is the case of non-invasive prenatal testing in Germany. So let's start from the theory. Yeah, it worked. As for the theory, I start from the assumption that ethics and the law are two differentiated and separate normative systems. So ethics includes for me all different systems of norms that prescribe moral behaviors, including, for instance, religious norms. So one of the main differences between those two normative systems is that ethical norms differ from one individual to the other, depending on their ideological background, religious affiliation, or their moral convictions. So these systems contains a plurality of moral options. It does not really speak in a unified way, but it consists of many different conceptions of morally correct behavior. In other words, there isn't one ethical system, but there are several ethical systems. So basically, I should have actually drawn one of those circles for each member of the society, since ethics and religion are not agreed upon by all individuals. So on the contrary, the system of the right, the system of law, is also a normative system, but it has exclusive validity within a given policy and territory. So legal norms are meant to be effectively accepted and obeyed by society as a whole. And of course, single individuals might not fully agree with the content of each law, but even if there might be laws that are controversial or whose content is controversial, the validity of them depends on the acceptance of the procedure by which laws come into being. So in other words, we accept the legitimacy of our system and of our lawmaking procedures, and therefore the outcome is also considered acceptable by each of us. So this is where my position is actually very controversial, because the relationship between ethics and the law is perhaps the most controversial topic in jurisprudence, I'd say. And while I maintain that the legal system derives validity from rules of acceptance and of recognition of the system as such, as I just explained, many scholars would claim that laws aren't valid unless they comply with certain moral standards. So in this regard, I do not deny that law can and indeed does open itself to values originally coming from ethics of morality. And ethical standards do influence our laws. They do it all the time. And there are also, for instance, ethical rules that are shared by all. And within the different ethical conceptions, there is a core of ethical values that might be accepted by each and every single of us indeed. So those widely accepted ethical norms can be codified in the law. For instance, if we think about the idea that it is morally wrong to kill, this idea becomes a legal norm that prohibits murder. In this case, however, ethical or moral principles, they are juridified. Basically, they become part of the law through the normal procedure of lawmaking, and they become thus subject to the rules of validity proper to the legal system. So they are integrated within the legal system, and they abandon the meaning that they had in the normative system of origin, the system of ethics. Some scholars have illustrated this concept by using a very powerful metaphor of the hands of Midas. Basically, they've been saying that just as whatever King Midas touched turned into gold, any concept that the law touches turns into a legal concept. So now I'm aware that this first description is quite a descriptive account, but I'd also like to claim that not only the separation between the normative system exists in a factual manner in my theory, also using evaluation criteria internal to the legal system, it is legitimate and desirable that those two normative spheres remain separated. So I will explain this normative part by coming to the example of the German constitutional system. And as we can see, in a legal society such as the German one, a little bit, I also mentioned it before, there is a factual assumption that there is a plurality of religious, philosophical, and moral views. And the Constitution regards this ethical pluralism not only as a fact, but also as a value, and a value that needs to be preserved. The preservation of this value and of the value of the ethical autonomy of each individual is guaranteed by the Constitution through a so-called principle of neutrality of the state. The state obligation to guarantee ethical pluralism through ethical neutrality is derived by a combined reading of different articles of the Basic Law, which prescribe, for instance, freedom of faith and conscience, equality, equal enjoyment of civil and political rights, and this independently of religious affiliation, the right not to be required to perform religious acts, and finally, the prohibition of an established state church. So this combined construction is confirmed by several decisions of the German Federal Constitutional Court that have indicated ethical neutrality as a binding obligation for the state. For instance, in a judgment on abortion, it was a judgment of May 1993, the German Federal Constitutional Court maintained that the state must remain religiously and ideologically neutral. This abortion decision also helps us understanding the scope of the state obligation of neutrality. This obligation is in fact conceived in the sense of a neutrality of justification, meaning that state action must be neutral not necessarily with regard to its effect, but only with regard to the justification of the intervention. Let's take, just for exemplify this, the court's reasoning in the abortion decision. The court says that the protection of the right to life of the fetus stems directly from its right to dignity, which is protected at Article 1 of the German Basic Law. But it also says that if, on the contrary, a right to life of the unborn child could only be justified having a particular religious conviction in mind, there would be no legal basis or justification for its protection by the state. So the concept of neutrality as neutrality as justification is the most accepted concept at the moment in the German liberal scholarships. And once again, it doesn't entail neutrality of effect of state actions, but it entails that the respective neutrality standard is determined by assessing the acceptability of the justification behind the state action. So now you can keep in mind this framework of neutrality while we go through the case study that I selected to answer the question I posed at the beginning. The case study, as I announced, is non-invasive prenatal testing, which is a test for the detection of chromosomic trisomies in the DNA of the fetus. This test can tell us if a fetus is affected by serious genetic conditions such as Down's, Edwards, or Patau's syndromes. Now I'm sorry for everyone who has to suffer through my description and my drawing here, but I hope I can at least give a rough idea how the test works. As you can see, some DNA from the placenta, which is very similar to the DNA of the developing fetus, is released and circulates in the blood of the mother. So thanks to the discovery of this circulating DNA, now information on the fetal DNA can be discovered by testing a blood sample of the mother. In this way, a simple analysis of the maternal blood can give an accurate estimation of the chance that a fetus has chromosomic trisomies. The test is a real revolution in the area of prenatal screening because it is exactly because of its non-invasiveness. Most of the previous existing tests for chromosomic trisomies, in particular, I'm referring to amniocentesis or chorionic villus sampling, they are performed by piercing directly into the placenta. And this invasiveness makes them dangerous in the way that they carry a small but still worrisome risk of miscarriage. So now the reason why I chose this example to answer my question is because the use of this test raises several ethical concerns. But actually, even more interesting for me, many of the ethical concerns that are raised with regard to NIPT are related not to the use of each single test, because we could consider that the single test is only an improvement of prenatal screening procedures that were already performed, but more precisely to its possible use on a large scale and to its coverage by the public healthcare system. So those factors are obviously connected. It is quite intuitive that the use of a health technology on a larger scale is determined very much by its availability in the public healthcare system. If the national healthcare system offers and reimburses the technology, more people will make use of it, either because they will be offered the technology as a part of a national screening program and maybe they didn't know about it before, or just simply because they won't have to pay for it out of pocket. So in the case of NIPT, this has been demonstrated by a study that investigated the impact of health insurance coverage on the uptake of the test. So this particular study was actually conducted in the Swiss healthcare system, but it can be applied to other publicly funded healthcare systems. So as I said, in the case of NIPT, it is not very much the fact that a single test is performed that it is controversial, but the fact that the test is widely available through the healthcare system. And that's what makes it the best example for my question. And in particular, I can exemplify this by explaining you following controversial points about the test that stands out. So first, the safety of the test could lead to an overall increase in the screening request, which would eventually result in a higher abortion rate. So the idea here is that the invasiveness of the previous procedures and the risk of miscarriage were a strong enough obstacle to discourage pregnant women from undertaking the test unless they had a pregnancy at high risk. So now with a test as simple as non-invasive prenatal testing, it is feared that all women, no matter what the risk or age is, would decide to make use of those tests, just to be sure. And as an effect, more fetuses with chromosomic trisomies would be detected and likely aborted. So this concern is also particularly relevant for those who believe in the religious dogma of the sanctity of the life of the embryo. In the same way, a widespread use of NIPT could also increase a sense of discrimination and of stigmatization against people of disability. There is also the fear that reimbursement of those tests would cause a shift of public resources from providing care and inclusion mechanism for disabled people to only investing in screening procedures. Moreover, it is also feared that the autonomy of the couples to choose whether they want to have this information on their unborn baby in the first place could be jeopardized by a social pressure to take the test. Consider that in the reimbursement scenario, the test would be for free and absolutely safe. Also, it is feared that the way the test is performed might cause its routinization and might mislead the woman. It is argued that it could be possible that amongst all the many regular blood tests during the pregnancy, the woman wouldn't realize what information this particular test is actually going to tell her. So we see that all those issues are linked to either a quantitative element of a widespread use of the test or to its being part of the services offered by the public health insurance. So not very much to the fact that one single woman decides to take this test, but the fact that the use of this test could become widespread through the reimbursement. All those concerns have been raised in Germany, where there has been a very heated ethical debate. After the first test went on the market in 2012, in 2014, a procedure of medical device evaluation was initiated by the Federal Joint Committee. This committee in German is called Gemeinsamer Bundesausschuss, but now for everybody's relief, I would just really refer to it as GBA. And this GBA is a public body that defines which specific healthcare services are paid for by the statutory health insurance. So the beginning of this evaluation procedure, this medical device evaluation procedure, is the first step for the inclusion of a new technology in the benefit basket of the public health insurance in Germany. And the decision to initiate evaluation of NIPT by the GBA sparked deep ethical discussions. The weekly newspaper, the Zeit, published an article in January 2015 denouncing that reimbursement of NIPT could be a first step towards what it calls a society that wants to get rid of people with disabilities. Also, a group of MIPs, members of the parliaments, signed a letter to ask the GBA to consider the ethical and social consequences in the medical evaluation of the test. The GBA was thus forced to respond to this allegation, and they decided to publish 2 official positions in which they reassured the public that they would take into account and treat with great sensitivity the ethical concerns raised by the NIPT. They also stated that the German Ethics Council would be consulted during the procedure. But as a reaction to these statements of the GBA, it has been questioned in the legal scholarship whether this public entity would even be allowed to take ethical consideration into account in the first place. In fact, if we look at the legal requirements for reimbursement by the statutory health insurance, they are very clearly indicated in an exhaustive list, which is to be found in paragraph 135 of the 5th book of the German Social Law Code. So according to this article, the GBA must take into account only 3 elements for the reimbursement decisions, which are diagnostic benefit, medical necessity, and economic efficiency. So from this legal perspective, there is no space for ethical concerns. And these 3 criteria, they need to be checked not only in absolute, but also in comparison with other services already included in the benefit basket of the healthcare system. And especially if we consider other services already reimbursed, NIPT seems actually an excellent candidate to become part of medical care during pregnancy. In comparison to invasive procedures, which are already reimbursed, such as amniocentesis, NIPT is not only cheaper, but it is also safer. The Institute for Quality and Efficiency in Healthcare, who conducts health technology assessment for the GBA, confirmed that NIPT fulfills all criteria for reimbursement. It determined its accuracy and its safety, and the medical necessity of the test was grounded in the need to enable pregnant women to have information on the presence of trisomies in the fetal DNA. So if we consider this exhaustive list of criteria in the current law, it is already doubtful whether ethical considerations could legitimately play a role in the reimbursement decision. But of course, one could ask, could the legislator change the law and ask the GBA to take ethical concerns into account? And this question requires us to go back to the theoretical and constitutional framework of neutrality or justification. So according to this framework, the consideration of ethical concerns in the reimbursement decision doesn't seem legitimate. In fact, according to the principle of neutrality of justification, the only legitimate reason for a refusal to reimburse a technology would be one based on legal and constitutional elements, and including obviously those that might have originated in the ethical system, but have been now transposed in the legal system by the end of Midas. So this is because state action can only be legitimately justified by elements of a system whose validity is widely recognized and accepted as binding by society as a whole. From this point of view, a request to the GBA to consider ethical concerns as such would be illegitimate. On the other hand, some of the ethical concerns raised by the test might belong to this juridified area, in which case they could play a role, but that would not be in their ethical quality, but rather in the form in which they have been accepted as a widely shared legal or constitutional principle. So to understand whether this is the case, it would be actually necessary to check in how far each ethical concern that is raised from the use of NIPT might have a legal correspondent. For instance, if we think about the issue of routinization of the test that I previously mentioned, in legal terms, this is not problematic as such. It is not a legal problem that more women, when presented with a choice, do decide to take the test. In legal terms, the problem is perhaps rather one of informed consent. So the law wants to protect the informed consent of the woman who must fully understand what diagnosis she's going through. So we could go through some of the other concerns in more details if you wish, maybe during the discussion, but at the moment, my conclusion is that following purely legal criteria, NIPT should be considered a valid innovation for the statutory health insurance, which is, by the way, also confirmed by how the story of the German case ended as the GBA finally decided to include NIPT in maternity care. This example shows that according to the principle of the ethical neutrality of the state as neutrality of justification, access to a health service could not be legitimately denied on the basis of purely ethical consideration. Those concerns could only play a role through their legal or constitutional equivalence, since arguments drawn only from specific ethical or religious conviction cannot be considered widely shared and imposed to society as a whole. So with this, I am done with my presentation, and I'm very much forward to your questions or comments.